it's fairly obvious that the moment you start having robots kill people for you, then you're kind of building up a problem for the future.
Yeah, a huge problem.
Coincidentally, we're currently having robots kill people for us. Hooray!
Mm-hmm. Right.
We're in that part of the robot rebellion curve.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, did they put like a Gatling gun on one of those little dog robots?
They absolutely did.
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show.
Yes, sirree, because we all know the past was horrible, and the only point of learning about or preserving the horrible, horrible past is so we can know what we've got it better now. That's history. That's education. That's progress.
I was listening to the audiobook of that this morning, and that line came up, and it is delivered. The audiobook's great.
Far better than I did.
It's so good. The read, I can't remember who the narrator is, but the audiobook narrator like really captures the different. Is it you? You read your own book?
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Holy crap.
That's awesome.
I did not know that. I was listening to it. I was going, wow, this like British dude is really great, capturing all these voices so wonderfully, and it was you the whole time. Oh, that's fantastic. Well, A+, you did a great job. Well, I'm Sean.
I'm Daniel.
And today we're joined by Adrian Tchaikovsky, award-winning author of multiple series, including Children of Time and The Final Architecture, as well as many standalone works, some of them which involve alien bug monster creatures thingies, which it always fills me with joy. The latest in the book we're talking about today is Service Model, released this month, at least of the recording, by Tor.com, and we're excited to talk to him today. So welcome, Adrian, to the show.
Thank you. It's lovely to be on.
So excited. The fact that you're the audiobook narrator, like that's just going to get me all day.
That makes it a great opportunity to ask questions specific about that as well, because the person who did it is right here.
Also, you need to narrate more audiobooks.
I've done a few novellas of my own. I've only ever done my own work. I'm not sure I'm qualified to do anyone else's, but yeah, this was my first full-length novel narration, and I've got another one lined up, so I am sort of expanding my range.
Awesome. Congratulations.
Just so you know, but if I ever publish a novel and they're like, who would you like as your audiobook narrator? I'm mentioning you.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you.
Because I probably would write something slightly comedic, and you have really good comedic timing in your voice. So, A+.
Okay, before we get into any more discussion, a reminder to our listeners, please share your questions and comments with us about our show at skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions. They could get discussed right here on future shows. And if you aren't already, please join us on Twitch for Sean's Alphabet streams. Fridays, last one will be at 6:30 p.m. Central, but starting in July, they're going to be at 7 p.m. Central to be part of our interactive live streaming format. Also, be sure to join our Patreon to be part of our special Patreon-only events on Discord, and that only takes $1 a month.
And obviously, you get lots of stuff with that. We do an exclusive podcast on there. You can vote in the Torture Cinema poll, all that good stuff. You get to talk to us in our Discord, which is probably terrifying for some people. So, and just as a reminder, this is a fan-based show, and none of us are rich. So it does help. Like just to pay for hosting and stuff. Just saying.
Right. And also, what also helps a lot is if you can tell folks about the show and review us on iTunes, Podchaser, Good Pods, whatever you happen to use. That word of mouth is really a big deal for fan-run podcasts. So we appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right. So, Adrian, you wrote this book called Service Model. And could you give us kind of a brief idea of what is this book about?
So my one-line pitch for this was it's Mad Max starring C-3PO. Alternatively, for a deeper dive, it's putting the butler in Butlerian Jihad. So It's the end of the world. Society is collapsing. Charles is a robot valet who has had a long and peaceful life on a remote manor, who goes on to inexplicably murder his owner and gets, understandably, thrown out, sent to be diagnosed, and finds out that the entirety of the civilization he is nominally a part of is falling apart. And all that is left is a lot of very earnest robots desperately trying to do the very limited task that they were programmed for. And hilarity and indeed tragedy ensues.
I think that's fairly accurate. Yeah. I mean, you wrote the book. Of course it's accurate. You know. So I'm kind of curious what, and I know that Daniel has written this question down, but it was the same question I think we both want to ask, which is where did this story come from? Because I think for me, I was thinking, we don't normally get stories from the perspective of, a service robot that whose sentience is perhaps not as clear. Usually, like, if we get that perspective, like, they're basically just a human, they just happen to have a robot body. But this is a robot that is developing throughout the story and kind of begins essentially in a service robot role in very firm fashion. So I'm kind of curious, where did the genesis of this come from?
So I am reasonably well known for writing stories with non-human protagonists and non-human points of view. That's very much where I kind of made my name in the genre. And so I kind of felt, well, I've got to do a robot book at some point. I've got to actually have, given that that's such a huge part of the sort of the genre DNA. But in particular, there is a single scene in, I think it's the restaurant at the end of the universe, that really prompted this book. So Zaphod is on a completely barren wasteland world where a civilization has completely collapsed. He finds a working spaceship. It's full of people in suspended animation, and the spaceship is waiting for a consignment of lemon-scented paper napkins before it can take off. And there is a conversation between the ship and Zaphod where he says, look, the world has ended. There aren't any lemon-scented paper napkins out there. And the ship replies, well, at some point there will be a new civilization, and it's quite possible that they will develop their own lemon-scented paper napkins, and then we can take off. And it's that combination of utterly comprehensible logic leading to this completely obstinate and nonsensical result that I'm very much trying to channel throughout this book in all the different interactions. Well, in Charles himself, honestly, and then in all the other robots he runs into, who are all also just trying to do their best in a situation where their best just doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Were you also trying to channel Douglas Adams sort of humor through this, or is it something that already kind of just came naturally to you too?
I mean, this is the closest to Adams I'm ever going to get, I think, is the answer to that. I wouldn't ever claim to say that I can do Douglas Adams because
Sure.
I don't think anyone other than Douglas Adams could. But I think that this is by far my best strike in that particular direction.
But the humor is it's interesting to raise the humor question because, I think you're always going to get those comparisons. Like, there's Pratchett and there's Douglas Adams, and there's a variety of, classic genre fiction authors that do a sort of comedic mode. And there is comedy throughout this it's almost like tragicomedy to some degree, I would say. But it has your own, like, flavor of comedy in it. There's a Tchaikovsky strangeness to the humor that I think is very unique and is in some of your other work, even when you're being much more serious in some of the other work. And I'm kind of curious for you, how do you talk about, like, where your comedic styling, like, developed or came from? Like, what was it, Adams that influenced you, or was it like you just woke up one day and were talking to an insect and, like, it gave you your sense of humor? Like,
I mean, I think there are the, like, the comic greats. There's Adams and there's Pratchett, and there's a lot of British sort of sitcom stuff in there. So Blackadder and that kind of thing. That particular sort of dry delivery I'm very fond of. But also, I mean, honestly, I tend to go comedy when I'm going bleak. And I think it's the best way of writing a very, very bleak narrative is to heavily season it with humor, because that kind of makes it palatable. In the same way that, say, Joe Abercrombie or KJ Parker's books are often very funny at the same time as they're being incredibly sort of depressing, incredibly grim, but there's always a joke. And it's one I always feel that a lot of the grimdark writers that follow on from them and don't get that, and they just sort of pile on the misery without anything leavening it, that tends just to lead to a very downbeat narrative that doesn't really give the reader anything. You kind of you've got to give a bit of depth by pulling back a little from that sort of everything is so horrible. And yeah, in the world that Charles discovered outside the gates of his manor, everything is so horrible. So the best way of dealing with that is to make it all so funny.
Mm-hmm.
Either that or I'm a sociopath. One of the two.
So it's
but it is. I mean, you mentioned British comedy. You know, my brother watches it a lot more stuff coming out of Britain than I do, but I do enjoy a lot, frankly, more British comedy stylings than I do American. And like I'm thinking about, like, I don't want to get to the politics, but like Brexit, complicated mess, blah blah blah, right? But like when you look at all the comedians in Britain, like it is biting social commentary with lots and lots of like they're laughing at themselves. Even some of the best British comics like have been implicated in like tax fraud schemes and so on, and they'll just take a ribbing in public, just getting ripped to shreds with, you know, all sorts of different comedic stylings. Like even they get Germans in there to make jokes. So I feel like there is something about British comedy like in that can like handle when things are just grim in a way that sometimes American comedy doesn't know how to handle. I mean, not like in a universal sense, but I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's just because you're on an island that is like stereotyped as having very dreary weather and so everything seems dreary, or I don't know where it comes from, but you guys have got it.
It's interesting you mentioned Blackadder, because there are a few times in reading this that made me think of that in particular. And when you were giving the summary of the plot, the first moment was the sort of death of the manor owner of Charles while shaving. And I thought of in Blackadder, there's the political episode in
accidentally tragically cut his own head off while shaving.
Yes, exactly. That was
I'm sure
immediately
that
came to mind while reading it.
That must have been in my head, honestly, writing that.
So one question is, do you have a copy of the American edition on hand that you're able to? Okay. Well, I could read, if you don't mind, I was going to read a brief quote from it that I'd marked down in terms of the humor that particularly struck me. To be the boss of an office at the project is to be responsible for creating a historically authentic atmosphere for all the other workers. It is absolutely vital that appropriate levels of intrusive micromanagement, divisive paranoia, bullying, and the threat of arbitrary punishments are maintained, so that we can truly recreate the folkways of the past. Also, a propensity for calling meetings at regular and indeed irregular intervals. And so when I read that the first time, I sort of went through all like the emotional roller coaster of laughing, then thinking, oh my God, how spot on accurate that is. And then this wave of depression came over me of feeling, oh my God, this really is what our lives are like. And then laughing again. And so that is one that I highlighted that I think kind of, for me, summarized the thoughts that Sean was expressing as well.
Is that office like over there too? Is that what it's like over there?
Yes, and I did my time in an office before I was finally able to go full time on the writing. And you get better or worse offices, but there have been offices I've worked at which were not sort of pleasant or nurturing working environments.
You could say these are not pleasurable working environments for the robots either.
Oh, well, but I mean, Charles would be the first to say that pleasure is not a thing he's designed for.
That is fair. Yeah. Okay, so we got to talk robots here. Science fiction is full of examples of like servant robots whose primary purpose is serving some human need. And one of the things I thought was very interesting throughout this work was the way that it very much begins from Charles's beginning is to go from just pure programming to like manipulating the like syntax of the programming to like, if you get what I mean, where he's like finding ways to make the like reinterpret the lines so that they allow him to do things that the programming technically isn't designed for, but if you just reinterpret it the right way, it works. And I wondered if to some degree this was you trying to tackle like the idea that like this like terror idea, like AI will become sentient or like robots will become sentient, but in a rather comedic and kind of almost logical way, in the way that the robots do it, of like getting to a point where they're making their own decisions. And that's kind of how they get there, is by like reinterpreting the rules as they go.
So, I mean, yeah, robot sentience is I mean, it's very much in the news, mostly because of the utter lack of sentience that all of the things alleged to be artificial intelligent actually have, which I think is coming out more and more obviously. It was, I mean, this is the core of the challenge I set myself with the book. Really, it's just so rather than having, let's say, the Star Wars version, or the actual C-3PO, where C-3PO is basically a person. He has feelings, he has thoughts, he is fully sentient, except that he's owned and can be destroyed and has zero rights, which remains one of the great unexamined things in that setting. But Charles would absolutely insist that he wasn't sentient. And having a protagonist who is the main point of view protagonist throughout an entire novel, and who has to do all of the things the protagonist does, and yet at the same time it's got to make sense from the point of view of him being a robot, a very complex human-facing robot. So, absolutely top of the line and very able to try and pursue his goals in unexpected circumstances, but still that at all times he's kind of got to be pursuing his goals. And then all of the other robots are doing the same, and then maybe they're not. And it's very much up to the user, good Lord, to the reader, to kind of spot when the robots may or may not be going beyond just being automata, because they're all very complicated and because we're very bad at picking things that are pretending to be human out from regular humans. I mean, we've seen recently that the Turing test isn't actually terribly good, because especially, you make a thing that is interacting in a human way, we immediately leap on it. I mean, traditionally, historically, we'll personify anything. We'll personify the weather, we'll personify places, we'll personify rocks. We will absolutely think of pretty much anything as if it is a person, at the drop of a hat. So having a thing that is actively able to talk to us in a human-like manner, it's no surprise that people assume there is everything human going on behind that kind of facade. And so the question is, in this book, how much is going on with any individual robot? Because there's quite a range of different levels of complexity going on, and different sort of functions of robot that we meet.
Well, that makes me think that to some degree, the reader might have to resist. Like, there's this point in the story where you mention that, like, having the protagonist, is it protagonist virus or protagonist? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was, maybe we may come back to that, but to some degree, like, the reader might have to resist the default reaction of, because the robot's the protagonist, our inclination is to treat them as human-ish, humanoid, human-like, a thinking agent similar-ish to us. And yet, yes, you're pointing out, right? It actually is much more complicated, because he does tell us at multiple points, right? He isn't really sentient. He's basically, this is what my programming says, and my programming says to do X, and so I'm going to do X, or X-ish occasionally.
Yes, and every so often, and Charles would, just when you get to the point of accepting him as a kind of fully agented protagonist, will do something completely outside the range of that, usually to do with his utterly cavalier sense of his own self-preservation.
Yeah.
This is weirdly, it turns up quite a lot when in panel discussions and things about AI. A lot of people start with the assumption that an artificial intelligence would have an inbuilt desire to preserve itself, which I don't think would be the case. I mean, that's the Skynet thing. That's the thing. Oh, well, if you try and turn it off, you've declared war on the robots. But we have an inbuilt desire for self-preservation from 500 million years of evolution, meaning that the things that didn't have a need for self-preservation didn't go on to have offspring. Now, that isn't going to be the case with any kind of artificially created system. It'll only have a sense of self-preservation if we tell it to have one. And if we tell it to stop having one, it'll stop caring about it again. And so there are many situations wherein Charles can understand that he's about to be destroyed or whatever, and actually doesn't mind because it seems to be filling a function at the time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the example when he's being turned into a data bank, they're going to turn him into a data bank, and the Wonk is there being like, "You gotta run, get out while you still can." He's like, "But this makes sense." Like, what do you mean? Like, it's a function. It does it. I'm going to be doing the function, and it's, I suppose, only when he questions how, like, he starts to do the math. Basically, he starts to go, "Well, wait a minute. This function is not. This is only temporary. So, like, what's its long-term purpose?" That only then does it start to matter to him.
Yep. I mean, I'm sure that if you go through with a fine-tooth comb, there are various points where that chain of logic doesn't quite hang together as much as it maybe should, and that may be Charles being more sentient than he should be, or it may be me not quite being as careful as a writer. But
well, it does raise an interesting concern. All of what you were saying, which is, you know, you mentioned, right, like if AIs can have self-preservation, you know, the most likely way it gets that is we put it in it. We give it that self-preservation motivation. But the only reason we would do that, or I mean, other than for funsies, just to see if we could, would be if that is for us a prerequisite of what constitutes sentient life. And
I don't think that's true. I think we would do it because
that's the reason we do it.
No. I mean, self-preservation is the third of the three laws of robotics in Asimov, and it's not there because we think they're sentient. It's there because they are valuable property. So if you have a robot which is in a dangerous work environment, or is a military robot or something like that, you would probably give it self-preservation at some point, and you would, honestly, Asimov thought through those rules pretty solidly. So a military robot probably wouldn't be bothered about not letting humans come to harm, but it would probably have, first off, obey orders, second off, don't let yourself get destroyed, which is obviously going to be a problem if obey orders becomes compromised, because then you've got a robot that won't let you get anywhere near it. There's a reason going back all the way to RUR, where it's when you make robots soldiers, that's when the problems start.
Yeah, because they can't be soldiers and follow the 3 laws of robotics, because they would harm humans.
That's like 20, 30 years before the 3 laws of robotics even. But it's just it's fairly obvious that the moment you start having robots kill people for you, then you're kind of building up a problem for the future.
Yeah, a huge problem.
Coincidentally, we're currently having robots kill people for us. Hooray!
Right.
We're in that part of the robot rebellion curve.
I mean, did they put like a Gatling gun on one of those little dog robots?
They absolutely did.
It reminds me every time of the scene for Jurassic Park where he's like, your scientists are so preoccupied with whether they could, they didn't think about whether they should. Like, yeah, we put it on there. Isn't it cool? And it's like, but if it becomes autonomous, you give it the ability to make decisions on its own. Are you sure it's going to make the right decisions?
The other way you could get self-preservation, I could imagine, coming about through artificially constructed organisms, for want of a word, would be indirectly through programming them towards just replicating themselves. Because if you create, basically the requirements for evolution are that you have some code, DNA in our case, that gets inherited. And so if you have a system of reproducing yourself, and that can be inherited, and that you then have the ability to change the code in some way, and if you have the ability that not everything is going to reproduce equally or be successful at it, you're going to get evolution. You're going to get that drive to survive within that artificially constructed thing, even if you might not explicitly program it in.
Yeah, it depends. If you have an imperfect copying sequence at some point, so that you can effectively get mutations in, so that you get ones that will reproduce better than others. At that point, you actually do have full-on evolution going.
Right.
And it will go wild very quickly, I suspect.
Oh, it could be scary because they could replicate faster than us.
Well, I mean, scary, but also, from the point of view of you would actually be able to have an entire robot ecosystem turn up in a very, you could seed a planet with replicating robots and come back in 100 years, and you might have, you'd have no control over what you got, but you could have really quite a spectacularly varied sort of set of interacting robot species.
A very different kind of life.
Yeah, and I mean, I suspect there must be quite a few sci-fi books. I think Tony Ballantyne wrote some where that seems to be what's been going on.
Well, one of the ones that comes to my mind, it's a different take on it, I guess, would be the German-Canadian production Lex. I don't know if either of you have ever seen it, where like the hands or the arms replicate themselves and basically turn all matter in the universe to just themselves, replicating throughout. And so it kind of be that kind of life, I guess.
There is so much joyously bonkers stuff in Lex.
Oh, there is. Yes,
it is, yeah. I remember rewatching that recently, and I was like, no wonder this wasn't on at a time that I was normally up. It definitely had stuff from when I was a kid, and there's no way an adult would have let me watch that show.
As I was reading Service Model, though, too, I think there were points where I don't remember the particular Lex episode, but I thought there was one where they went to a planet that, of course, kind of like the humans were all, or I think in that case, completely extinct. And what was left behind was sort of just the technology still running on what that planet or that space station had done.
You have like the holographic Tim Curry as the poet.
I believe it may have been.
They
may have even done it more than once, like some variation of it. But the sort of like absurdities that come about of trying to deal with this artificial intelligence or lack of intelligence, as we might describe it, was kind of a recurring theme in that series. And so this gave me vibes of that as well when I read it.
There's definitely there's a bit in Lex as well where you kind of have an entire civilization getting just sort of effectively progressively annihilating itself. And so you've got fewer and fewer left, and it ends up with just these two sort of creatures with guns shooting each other, and then there's nothing left. And I think that particular sequence fed into Service Model because of that, just the inexorable logic and efficiency of a completely pointless act.
Mm-hmm. So while we're on that topic, one of the questions I did have was just more in general in terms of the inspirations for Service Model. And one of the things that I completely missed until I read up, kind of researching before the interview, are the titles for the different parts. I was racking my brain, and I'm a little slow, and hence I was not getting them until I read someone else's in terms of what those part titles actually convey or mean. And so I was curious a little bit about those inspirations, but then also other ones that there may have been. So for instance, part 1 is KR15-T.
Yes. This is basically my own small joke entirely for my own amusement. I realized as I got toward the end of the first section that, wait a minute, this is basically a country house mystery, which somehow I had not picked up on while writing it. And then obviously I play it up a bit with the detective and so forth. And so I then looked at the rest of the book and thought, actually, each section of this sort of weird travelogue road movie sort of book is kind of its own genre, and it's kind of each one you can find a particular writer who is exemplary for that. And so each of the section titles are this sort of almost leet speak transliteration of the surname of the relevant author. And it's one of those, it probably looks a lot more clever than it actually is, because it is absolutely just my own minuscule joke.
Well, I actually love that it's sort of the reverse direction than I would have thought of at first, that you intentionally set out to write 5 parts according to the styles or featuring the sort of either philosophies or plot points or sort of the tropes of a particular author or genre, but that it was the reverse, that you just wrote these in this sort of episodic nature that works really well for this journey novel. And then notice those connections. So to me, that's actually more brilliant.
It was like I say, it was about the end of the first part, so I'm
Okay.
leaning into it
Yeah.
from then on, and I'm more deliberately evoking the authors I'm naming and the genres they write in. But yes, it wasn't there at the absolute outset. It wasn't there as part of the plan, and I do seem to benefit a lot from serendipity in this sort of thing. In that once I had the idea, I was like, actually, yes, I can. There isn't that one section which just that doesn't fit into the pattern at all, and if I do something with it, it will be rather forced. Everything had a natural home when I got to that point.
I had a question and then it just left my brain. Okay.
So I guess to give Sean
go ahead, Daniel. No, please jump in. Yeah.
To give Sean a chance, kind of following up on that.
Yeah.
One of the questions I did have is, I know that in general you are I understand you are a planner in terms of writing. You sort of map everything out. I was curious if this required any new kind of technique, particularly in sort of following the logic maps of Uncharles. As I read it, I almost there were times where I kind of sat back and thought, I wonder how he's writing this. Did he map out in actual a diagram of how this would flow?
A decision tree?
A decision tree, exactly. Or did you just sit down and type it? So that had me curious.
I mean, I think decision tree would have been more appropriate. I mean, as it happened, I think this fit into my normal kind of planning routine, which is just a sort of a chapter by chapter breakdown. I had the major points, effectively the major twists of each section of what is the mad thing the robots are doing in this particular bit, very much in my head at the start. And then, so you get the first 4 sections, which are these kind of the larger examinations of particular sort of nonsense logic. And then the 5th section has a sort of a portmanteau of several different ones. And then you get the denouement where you would get at least some answers as to what on earth is going on. But it worked. I tend to do a very linear plan. I do chapter by chapter, beat by beat, and it fit very nicely into that. And that is, so I don't think it's particularly different to most of my work, except I'm currently trying to mix it up a bit with my current fantasy series in that I'm not planning that at all. I'm just, I'm creating the world and the characters, and then I'm just essentially following characters around with a notebook and seeing what they do, given that sort of initial trajectory that the world gives them. And that's it. That seems to work very nicely for a sort of an interweaving mosaic of lives sort of novel. But yes, everything else is very much just a chapter and beat list on a page that I'm following.
Okay.
Interesting. So regarding the plot, I mean, you've kind of already told us this, and I was kind of curious. We've seen apocalyptic stories typically from human perspectives, where things are falling apart or have fallen apart, some variation of that, and then we get the human responses. But here, because your main character is Charles/Uncharles, and pretty much most of our characters in the book are robots as a consequence of Charles being our POV character, we're getting a very different view of collapsing society from agents that are much more rigid in their thinking and more systematic, which I find a very interesting contrast, because when I think about humans, we can be illogical and we make ridiculous decisions and bad things happen and we have trauma and emotion and all of this stuff embodied in that. But a robot doesn't necessarily have almost any of those things. It's looking at its programming. It's looking at how to make that programming operate in its present conditions. And so I was kind of curious, did you kind of see yourself as doing a contrast, or did this sort of naturally occur because you saw that I'm going to write a robot protagonist and that is a natural consequence of how the story unfolds?
So I think the big difference between robots and humans is is effectively it's the moral dimension. So all of the or the vast majority of the characters in the book are basically they are doing their best. They are not malign. They cannot generally, even if they are doing terrible, terrible things, they can't necessarily be blamed. There are maybe a few where I am sort of looking somewhat side-eye at precisely how they decide to go about what they are trying to do. But in general, there is what I'm going for is there is an odd purity and innocence to robots because they are just trying to do what they have been told to do. And they don't have the context to make a wider moral judgment on whether that thing needs to be done. I mean, that's generally the question that no robot is ever going to ask is, do I need to do the thing that I've been programmed to do? And it's very clear all the way through that people have not been terribly careful in how they tell robots what to do. I mean, there's one of the few human characters in the book has a constant running battle with his robots because he cannot phrase instructions properly.
It goes very badly for him.
Yes. But that's obviously all of the robots kind of bear the fingerprints of that kind of thinking. And it's, we're living in a world now where you've got artificial systems that will tell you to eat poisonous mushrooms because no one has really thought about whether you want it doing that and how it goes about that job. We've just unleashed these things in the world. So I mean, weirdly, since I wrote the book, my view on how humans set robots up to do things has only become more and more accurate in the worst possible way. But it also makes the robot characters, it gives them a particular pathos that I think human characters wouldn't have. Because a human character would have that moral perspective. They would be acting with or against what is going on. They would have a responsibility for their actions in the way that the robots don't. And so you get all of these rather lost and forlorn robots. And for me, I mean, and this may just be me being fairly misanthropic as far as relating to humans goes, but that is a whole extra layer of sort of heartstring tugging, that you get these robots who are frequently doing terrible things, but they're doing terrible things just because they are trying to do the right thing, and the right thing is what they've been told to do. Even down to character, there's a particularly appalling character called Hoppity Jack, who you meet fairly briefly in one of the sections. And I mean, Hoppity Jack's logic works perfectly well. It's just that he's been programmed very badly.
There's like a layer too of like with humans, like if the human does the wrong thing based on our judgment, right? We go and we say, like, as you're kind of pointing out, like morally they've done a bad, and so they're a bad person. Like, I'm thinking like if Walking Dead was just robots instead of all the characters in Walking Dead, right? We would kind of be at this point of, well, but we can't really morally judge the robots for running around doing all of the killing because they're robots. They don't have the same moral framework as humans. They may not strictly, quote unquote, know better, right? And so there's a kind of interesting dynamic where we can simultaneously sympathize and also not like negatively judge as immoral robots in this story in a way that we can't with any human character we might encounter, which is super fun and also like probably going to twist a philosopher's brain in circles at some point.
Well, one of the things that I find interesting about this is throughout, but then particularly at the end with the god robot, you have, even though the robots lack sort of moral imperatives directly or by those terms, there are glimpses that they are capable of a morality or a system of morality sort of unto their own based on, it's hard not to anthropomorphize words, sort of like pride of wanting to fulfill their programming and do it in the best possible way based on what is available. They strive for efficiency and success in what they have been designed to do. And what frequently happens in several of the robot characters, I thought, was that they choose to follow their programming with either malignancy or a hint, rapidly, or they wait a quarter of a second before really doing it. And so there's sort of that level where the robots are making value judgments based on who they're interacting with and what they're being asked to do, of whether they're going to do it happily or do it with sort of reticence and a low-brimming hatred of who is interacting with them. And I found that really interesting.
Yes, and if challenged on that point, they would all absolutely deny that it would be possible for it to happen. And I think there's even a scene where Charles is expressly saying that this sort of thing could never happen while he himself is doing it. And is kind of aware he's doing it. But one of the other weird things is I get into logic paradoxes at one point. Okay, that's the traditional cipher. How do you shut down a robot? You get an insoluble problem. And one of the things that kind of came about, and one of the things that it's absolutely being borne out by the current sort of ChatGPT style AI, is actually logic paradox is not a problem for an artificial system. You can tell it to completely contradictory things. It's fine with that. Logic paradoxes are a problem for people because we have that inbuilt sort of system of logic that we need to square. But robots wouldn't need cognitive dissonance. You can have a robot believing 6 impossible things before breakfast, or whatever the Alice in Wonderland quote is.
Reminding me of every time I took one of my students who's a poet into ChatGPT and tried to force ChatGPT to write a poem that wasn't rhyming, because it can't. I mean, maybe a new version can, but like you would tell it that poem rhymes, give me a non-rhyming poem, and it would just give you another rhyming poem. You're like, but that one rhymes. And it's like, you're correct. Please give me one that doesn't rhyme. Here's one that doesn't rhyme. And it rhymes again. And I'm just like, my brain is going, right? Like, book and cook rhyme. You know this.
but at the same time, and it works in reverse. You can say, give me words that rhyme with this, and it will give you a bunch of words, and some of them will and some of them won't. Right. And it's that utter lack of context. And again, it's this weird thing that this wasn't really kind of, I think it was in its very early stages of this current AI bubble when I was writing the book. And it's not, I mean, it's almost like the sci-fi writer's specific curse is, may the world become more like your books.
It's a ridiculous
that's a scary
place.
thing.
We're in a ridiculous place right now.
So
your robots are more fun. I like yours more.
Better than many of the humans.
Yeah, I agree. Mr. Washburn, Dr. Washburn, whatever.
Yeah.
Ugh, that guy.
Another thing I found interesting in here with the robots is that there's a robot dream presence of surpassing themselves, of becoming more. And that's very common for human characters, particularly in this kind of genre of dystopia, of wanting to become something better in the face of things falling apart. But here we also have some robots that, in some ways, are experimenting or wondering, at least, whether robots can surpass their programming. Is that something that's possible or not? So I found that an interesting sort of, a lot of the novel goes into both the similarities between humans and robots and those ticks of distinction.
I mean, is there anything particularly you're thinking of? Because I'm drawing a bit of a blank on on where that necessarily comes up. So possibly it wasn't anything I was foregrounding while I was writing it.
So, for instance, the God robot at the end, unless I'm mistaken, I thought frequently or a few times said that a lot of what God was doing was designed to see if robots could surpass. So in some ways his programming told him to do this, but to surpass what robots were, and whether particularly Uncharles could surpass. You had the Gonk kind of saying that as well, but
yes, I mean God is by the God system is, as the name suggests, by far the most complex system. And so you've got an idea there that it's kind of predicting, well, if we get to this point, then there may be some emergent properties out of the robots.
Right.
And we get there are a few other moments. It's like there's the last conversation between Charles and the door, where he's saying, why did they build us in this kind of way? So there is you get that sort of slight speculation as to maybe there is a better way of doing things, which is kind of what Charles runs into quite early on when things aren't working at the manor. It's just like everything kind of seems to be broken, and he's complex enough to understand that, but not complex enough to really get to grips with what the concept means or to do
go the
about
further
it.
step. Right.
Well, I mean, in some ways, like, you're almost resisting the narrative we might expect from a robot story, which is like the robots figure it all out and they become super, like, at the end they're fully purely sentient and they've made their little robot society and they have subverted their programming and become robot peoples. And I guess in a lot of ways this story resists that by, and I don't know if it's because that is like somewhat fantasy thinking in a way where it's just it sort of, to some degree, maybe you're like suggesting that kind of revelatory end is maybe unrealistic for the kind of story we're actually being presented, which is a weird thing to say for a sort of tragic comedy kind of story. But to some degree, right? Like, if you think about it, the idea that they just, like, it all snaps into place and the robots are like, I am now person, hear me roar, is not a natural consequence of the kinds of things we're naturally seeing in this story, where, like, Charles, like, reinterpreting, the logic of a line, for example. And so I wonder if that's something, like, did you see yourself as sort of actively resisting that endpoint? Or is that just kind of a consequence of pulling back from that sort of grandiose, almost mythical narrative of the robot?
So one of the old things about my planning structure is the one thing I don't plan is the end. So I get to the point in the plot where kind of the players are assembled, you've got the denouement about to kick off, and then I kind of let the trajectory of the book carry me through that. So I was wondering whether we get to that point of, will we do the kind of sort of full-on emergent intelligence thing? And the more the more I wrote of the book, the less the book was going into that sort of place. And I think I would have needed some sort of big, fairly hand-wavy sort of plot element to turn up and to magic wand that kind of ending out of it. And I mean, I think it would have been a weaker book if it had gone that way, mostly just because it would, doing the whole, well, all the Pinocchios are now real boys sort of thing. All the robots are now people, is kind of beside the point. And also, the whole point of the book is, well, what is it like to be a robot when you're not a person, in the same way as I've done with spiders and octopuses and various other things in other books. So defaulting to making them human, although you'd kind of be on a stronger logical ground to do it with robots, given that they are human made, would, I think, have been the cop-out direction. So I'm kind of glad it didn't end up going in that way at the end. And so in the end, you do still have this sort of, it's not entirely clear how much agency and independence the robots have, although it's also patently not as simple as Charles would claim that it was.
And that for me is way more interesting, because I like ambiguity a bit, where the answer is not black and white, clearly distinct. And I guess this, in thinking on this particular issue, I'm not opposed to having sentient robots like that have become people. Like, that's perfectly fine. It's kind of fun. But also it is sometimes, I think, more interesting to sort of ground us in the reality that, like, making living beings is not, like, it's not easy. Like, look how far away we are right now from having anything we could call a sentient living thing that wasn't grown in a womb. Like, so, it's one of those things, I think science fiction, I love the imagination, right? That like we imagined, we created, peoples. But also, like, there is this, like, almost like imagination creep that science fiction can sometimes do, where it just like it misses all those middle parts. It just like bloop, it just skips past them, and like we won't talk about that bit. Like once we had robots that were toasters, and then now they're people, and like whoop, whoop, we'll just skip past that. But sometimes that middle bit is the interesting part, because that's where it's complicated, and there's going to be like some horrible philosophical arguments where people are like, is it really a person yet? And it's like, oh my God, is it? I don't know. Like, what is a person? I don't know.
Yeah, the complexity and ambiguity is great here, and I love that it didn't let up in the denouement and conclusion. And like the wonk in the book itself, we humans like crave simple, easy answers to explain what's going on and what situation we're in, and rarely are they, a simple black or white, clear-cut answer. And so I really enjoyed that. One of the other sort of question I had for you regarding the wonk and Uncharles' relationship is, it's not surprising to see writers sort of delve into assumptions of humans, and the concept to us is clear that we have first impressions, and it's hard to change our assumptions and first impressions. What wasn't immediately obvious to me, if I would have thought about it prior, was that robots might have that same issue of suffering from difficulty in overwriting first impressions and assumptions. And so why is that? Because I don't know entirely clear on maybe why a robot would have that problem, and what led you into thinking about doing that, I guess.
I think it certainly made sense to me as something that robots would probably do far more than people, because it constantly reevaluating your another kind of entity's place in the world is a very human thing. It's a very inefficient thing. It's not a thing that a robot would necessarily need to do. And a robot generally lives in a world where it knows what the other robots are and what the other humans are. And once you make that kind of categorization error where something is put in the wrong box, there's no particular drive to re-examine it. There's at no point you get to the prompt of, this is where you need to reassess your relationships with things, because robots under ideal circumstances would never need to do it.
And like you said before, I guess they can live with contradictions, unlike us.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
We're so weird. Humans are weird. It's weird to say, but like robots in this story feel normal.
Like, yes.
It feels like my work here is done.
I don't know. There's something about having a story about robot characters where you just kind of go, oh, I get how you got to that conclusion. That yeah, okay. Like, I get it. It makes sense. It's logical. But if a human did it, I feel like we'd just be like, why are you behaving like this? What's wrong with you? Because like we don't think of humans as programmed. We don't think of them as having programming. I mean, you do, Daniel, but like, as you're a microbiologist, you're weird.
Yes.
But like we would almost bristle at the idea, like, oh, humans were programmed by our genetics and DNA. But like with a robot, that's no, I'm just programmed. That's it. It is. I don't know where that comes from. Like, why are we like this? What's wrong with us?
I mean, I think this is something I look into in Children of Memory to a certain extent, is the idea that we are very assured of our own consciousness. And in Children of Memory, you actually have an equivalent situation with consciousness, where you have something that appears to be conscious, which absolutely insists that not only is it not conscious, but probably nobody else is either. And there is a certain amount of experimental data to suggest that a lot of the things that we think of as our decisions are not our decisions. They are things that a kind of convocation of grain cells has flipped onto, and then we post facto justify them. And so there's a lot going on in consciousness, which kind of seems to be almost parasitic to the working of the brain, which of course is, I mean, Peter Watts wrote about that very memorably in Blindsight, and far more eruditely than I ever could. But it's a genuine open thing of how much of what we think of, how much of the agency we think we have, do we actually have?
I mean, this is this is a huge problem we now have. I think my students sometimes are surprised when I'll ask them, like, do you think you have free will? And they'll be like, yes, of course I have free will. I absolutely do have free will. And I'm like, well, look at some neuroscience. Are you sure? Because the things you think you have free will for, some of those we have science that suggests that you don't. And so some decisions you make, maybe things you like your brain did it, and then like you think you. Or did you think? Did your brain make you think? I don't know. I don't know what's real anymore. We for all we know, we could find out this is the Matrix.
And the fascinating question is, if we don't have free will to the extent we have free will, why do we think we have free will, and why do we go to considerable length to defend our autonomy? Because that suggests there is a definite evolutionary benefit to effectively having that self-deception, if that is indeed what it is.
That's nuts to think about,
right.
Adrian. That's nuts. Like, at some point, we're going to get more answers to this, and I'm going to have the same existential crisis that I have every time I think about the question of, like, why does existence exist? Like, does the concept, like, that anything exists at all, like, the mere act of existing, why?
There are so many more books to be written here.
At some point, I will have to write a short story where we invent a new kind of instrument to look at the universe, and we look at people and we see that everyone has this hand coming in through our back, just puppeteering us around.
Yes, they're called microbes.
The cosmic church of Jim Henson is.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that'd be a terrifying story. You should write that to it. Well, I think we're getting pretty close, so we probably have to wrap up. And I don't want to because of having fun, but you have a life, and we can't take all of your life away. I mean, we could, but we're not going to because we're nice. Yeah. So the first of our closing questions, we're curious. I know that this book is just arriving, but what are you working on next that you're allowed to tell us about?
I mean, there's a lot in the pipeline that is submitted and won't be seen for a while. So I've just submitted a sequel to the novella Elder Race, which did very, very nicely. And I'm just about to start work on the new Children book. I've been immersing myself in actual full-on academic research for the last couple of weeks, which has been a bit brain stretchy.
That sounds exciting.
Yeah.
Well, we look forward to it. And yell at us because we will have you back.
Yes.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you. Thank you.
Daniel, the last question's for you.
Oh boy. Okay.
I'm trying to be nice. You're logic.
Sharing.
I was following my decision tree.
So, Adrian, where can folks find you online for more information?
There's a question that's got more complicated in the last couple of years.
Yes.
So adriantchaikovsky.com is the website. It will have an up-to-date list of books and short stories and occasional announcements. Other than that, my social media platform is Blue Sky these days. And I'm App Shadow, yeah.
So easy enough to find. He says smart things on the internet.
And I neglected to put it up earlier, but for those of you watching the video version, here is Service Module.
Oh, great cover, by the way.
So it's a really, really nice cover.
There's a completely different cover in the UK as well now, which is they like the hand holding the teacup one, which is, I think I've not had UK US covers that are that different for a while, so that's quite nice to see. So I'm always up to see varied cover art.
Me too. Yeah, it's kind of fun. Different approaches and stuff. Yeah, it's pretty fun.
Though I believe are the spellings Americanized, or are they still British?
I'm assuming they're Americanized because unusually for me, Service Model is a US first book that's coming out from Reactor or Tor.com as was. And it was then acquired by Pan Macmillan in the UK. So I'm assuming the original is US spelling.
Interesting. Okay.
I think
I
UK,
often pay attention, but for whatever, I got so into it, I didn't even notice.
Yeah, I think in the UK version, you comes with an extra little bag of U's that you can distribute throughout it.
Literally.
That's perfect. Every time you say the word color, we'll stick that U in. Probably Canada, too, because they do that,
Correct.
too. Yes. Yeah. I had a client once ask me, like about language for editing, and they were like, I'm going to be submitting to U.S. publishers. Like, how concerned do I need to be? And I'm like, okay, like you're not writing in a foreign language. Like you just put some U's in there, just check submission guidelines. Like if they need them out, they'll make sure that gets taken out before publication. But like, it's not like Canadian English is like a foreign language here.
There was an American board game called Endeavour where the UK version came with a little wooden U that you could include in the spelling.
I like that. I love
that. Was perfect. All right, Adrian, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you very much for having me on the show.
Been a pleasure. So for folks at home, if you have thoughts about this or you've read Service Model and you'd like to let us know what you thought, you can go to skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions, or you can send us an email, skiffyandfanty@gmail.com. We're Skiffy and Fanty on pretty much all the media sites, but we're especially on Blue Sky and Threads, Facebook. I don't know. We're places other than the one place nobody is anymore that matters. And you can find like our links to our newsletter, all that stuff. We have a link tree, which is linktr.ee/skiffyandfanty. And there's just tons of links there. You can find our Patreon and all that stuff. So please go there. For me, I'm at seanduke.net, and then I'm on Twitch at Alphabet Streams. I do my stuff Tuesdays, Thursdays at 7 p.m. Central, and Skiffy and Fanty starting July 2024 will also be, well, it's been there for a while, but it's now also doing it at 7 o'clock, but on Fridays. So there you go. And I've got a link tree as well. You can find me on lots of places, and mine is just /SeanDuke.
You can find me on Blue Sky as well at Reading 1000 Lives. 1000 is 1000. You can read my reviews on the Skiffy and Fanty blog, or also on my own blog, reading1000lives.com.
Excellent. Well, as required by the Skiffy and Fanty bylaws, I need to make this awkward, and I will just note, according to my new Tchaikovsky programming, I am now mandated to take one of Daniel's hands. Yes, I can take that one because you've proffered it. That is, of course, in my decision tree. It fully follows. Would you prefer that I use a scalpel or a chainsaw?
Chainsaw will be more fun.
Okay,
and probably quicker.
Fun is not a requirement for my programming, Daniel. We'll go with the chainsaw for efficiency purposes. It'll probably get done quicker.
So there
we go.
I'll just need to find some microbes to regenerate the hand afterwards. May the microbes be with you.
Yeah, on that note, awkward ending and scene. If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or skiffyandfanty.com, our website, where you can get access to all of our fancy things. Our music comes from Holy Mole. You can support him and his work at patreon.com/holymole. Thank you for listening.